There are things a person does when they know time is running short that they would not do otherwise. Not dramatic things. Not the grand gestures that get written about and remembered and turned into the official story of a final chapter. The quiet things. The specific choices that reveal, in retrospect, what a person understood about what was happening and what they wanted to leave behind. Ray Charles spent the last years of his life making an album called Genius Loves Company. The title was not accidental. Ray Charles was not a man who made accidental choices about language. Every word in that title was deliberate. Genius. The word that had attached itself to his name for decades, the word he had always worn with a slight distance, as though it described something real but not the most important thing about him. Loves, not loved, not has loved, not loved to work with, but loves, present tense, immediate, ongoing. Company, not collaborators, not fellow artists, not peers, but company. The word you use when you mean presence, when you mean the specific relief of not being alone. He was 72 years old when the recording sessions began. He had Parkinson's disease and liver cancer, both of which he had not disclosed publicly. He had, by the clinical assessments of his doctors, a limited amount of time remaining. He knew this. He had always been a man who preferred direct information to comfortable evasion, and his medical team gave him direct information. He chose to spend that time in the recording studio, not because he had to. He had nothing left to prove, no commercial obligation that required one more album, no career milestone that remained unchecked. He chose it because the recording studio was the place where everything in his life had always made the most sense, and he wanted to be in that place for as long as he was able. And he chose to fill that studio with other people. This is the story of those sessions. Of what Ray Charles said to each artist who came through that studio door. Of what he was doing in those final months that went beyond making a record. And of what he left behind that the Grammy Awards and the sales figures and the critical assessments do not fully capture. Something smaller and more specific and more lasting than any of those things. To parrot ONT to see some, the idea for Genius Loves Company had been developing for some time before the sessions began. Ray Charles had always been interested in collaboration, in the specific musical conversation that happens when two distinct voices attempt to occupy the same space, but he had been selective about it throughout his career, cautious about the conditions under which he was willing to work with other artists in the intimate setting of a recording studio. By 2003, something had changed in the calculation. He was not in a hurry. Ray Charles had never been a man in a hurry. His particular quality of attention, the deep and deliberate engagement he brought to whatever he was doing, was fundamentally incompatible with hurry. But there was, in the sessions for Genius Loves Company, a quality of intention that people who had worked with him throughout his career identified as different from his earlier work. Not urgency exactly, something more like clarity. The clarity of a man who knows what he wants and has set aside everything that is not that. What he wanted was company. The roster of artists who came to record with Ray Charles during those sessions was extraordinary. Norah Jones, B.B. King, Van Morrison, Gladys Knight, James Taylor, Elton John, Diana Krall, Natalie Cole, Willie Nelson, Johnny Mathis. Different generations, different genres, different relationships to the music Ray Charles had spent his career making. Some of them had grown up with his recordings as the soundtrack of their own musical formation. Others had arrived at him later through specific songs or specific moments. All of them came. The sessions were scheduled one at a time, one artist per day, or sometimes 2 days for the same artist if the material required it. Ray Charles was at the studio for every session, arrived on time, was prepared, knew the material. This was consistent with his entire professional life. But there was something else he did at the beginning of each session that the people who were present consistently noted as unusual. Before the music started, before the technical preparation was complete, before the instruments were fully set up, before the engineers had finished their work, Ray Charles would ask the arriving artist to sit with him for a few minutes, not to discuss the songs, not to review arrangements, just to sit and talk about whatever the artist wanted to talk about. Some of these conversations were brief, some went on for an hour. Some of the artists who participated in them spoke about what was said in the years afterward. Others kept it private. But what emerged from the accounts that became available over time was a consistent pattern in what Ray Charles was doing in those pre-session conversations. He was asking questions, not about music, about the other person. Par TWO. Mohati asked. Norah Jones was 23 years old when she came to record with Ray Charles. She had just released Come Away With Me, which had won 8 Grammy Awards and established her as one of the most significant new voices in popular music. She arrived at the studio carrying the specific combination of confidence and uncertainty that belongs to someone who has succeeded enormously and is still in the process of understanding what that means. Ray Charles asked her what she was afraid of. Not in a therapeutic way, not as an opener to a discussion of artistic anxiety. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without preamble. with the quality of someone who actually wants to know the answer and is prepared to wait as long as necessary to receive it honestly. She answered him. What she said was not something she repeated publicly in detail, but people who were in the room described her answer as taking several minutes and being, by the end of it, more honest than she had intended to be when she began. Ray Charles listened without interruption. When she finished, he said something in response that she has described in various interviews as the most useful piece of professional advice she has received in her career, though she has never quoted it directly. Then they made the record beat. King arrived with the specific ease of a man who had known Ray Charles for decades and who came to the session as a peer and a friend rather than as a younger artist meeting a legend. He and Ray did not sit for a long pre-session conversation in the same way. What they did instead was play. Before the session started, before the engineers were ready, before anything was officially underway, they played together at the piano and guitar in the informal way of musicians who have been playing music for 60 years each, and for whom music is the most natural form of conversation available. The engineer who was setting up the session and who witnessed this pre-session playing described it afterward as one of the most extraordinary things he had ever heard in a recording studio, not because of its technical complexity or its formal achievement, but because of the specific quality of ease between the two men who had been making music since before most people in the building had been born, playing together the way children play when they are genuinely absorbed in something, without performance, without self-consciousness, without any orientation toward an audience. Willie Nelson came on a day in late 2003. He and Ray Charles had a different kind of connection. Both men had spent decades navigating music industries that had not always been designed with their particular artistic visions in mind. Both had insisted on their own terms in ways that had cost them professionally at various points. Both had the specific equanimity of people who had been through enough to understand that equanimity is the only reasonable response to whatever comes next. They talked about time, about what it was like to have spent most of a life making music and to find that the music was still available to you, still present, still arriving, still capable of surprise. Willie Nelson said something about this that Ray Charles responded to with a long silence before speaking. What he said in that silence was not recorded. But Willie Nelson described the exchange in later years as one of the most honest conversations he had ever had about the experience of growing old without growing away from the thing you love most. Much at Tia Sesam Smarar, the official description of the Genius Loves Company sessions is a recording project, a collaborative album featuring Ray Charles and a range of guest artists, recorded over a period of months in 2003 and released posthumously in 2004. That description is accurate. It is also insufficient. What the sessions were, in the understanding of most of the people who participated in them, was something closer to a series of conversations that happened to produce music. Ray Charles was not simply making an album. He was doing something that required the presence of other people in a specific and irreplaceable way, not their professional contribution, not their voices and their instruments, though all of those things were also present. Their company, their actual physical present tense company in a room that Ray Charles had been occupying in various versions for more than 50 years. He was a man who had spent the majority of his professional life in recording studios. The studio was, in some fundamental sense, his native environment, the place where the internal architecture he had built since childhood found its most complete external expression. He had recorded thousands of songs in studios across 5 decades. He knew what studio sounded like, smelled like, felt like in the particular way of someone whose knowledge of environments was built entirely through non-visual senses. In those final sessions, he was filling the studio with voices, with presences, with the specific sounds of people he respected and in some cases loved, sitting in the same room with him, making music together. He was surrounding himself, in the place he felt most fully himself, with the company of people who understood what he was doing when he sat at that piano. Not all the way, not from the inside, but enough. Enough to be genuinely present. Enough to make the company real. Elton John came and they sang together, and at the end of the session, when the music was finished and the engineers were doing their work, Elton John sat with Ray at the piano for an additional hour that was not scheduled and that no one in the studio moved to interrupt. The piano between them was not being played. Both men simply sat near it, in the way that musicians sometimes need to be near an instrument, even when they are not using it, as though the instrument's presence is itself a form of company. What they talked about during that hour was not documented. Elton John has referred to it in interviews as one of the most important conversations of his adult life, without further elaboration. He has said only that Ray Charles said something to him about the relationship between a performer and an audience that he has never been able to forget. Something that changed the way he understood what he was doing every time he walked onto a stage. What that something was remains between the two men and the room that held it. Diana Krall came and they talked before the session about the specific experience of being a pianist who also sings, about the relationship between the two things, about whether the piano and the voice feel like one instrument or two, about what happens in the body and in the mind when both are happening simultaneously. Ray Charles had been navigating that relationship for his entire career. He had over 50 years, developed a theory of it that he had never been asked to articulate this directly before. He articulated it to Diana Krall in that studio in the hour before they recorded their song together. She listened with the attention of someone receiving something she would use for the rest of her career. James Taylor came. Gladys Knight came. And she and Ray Charles talked before the session about what it meant to have a voice that people recognized before they recognized your face, about the specific experience of being known entirely through sound, about whether that kind of recognition felt like intimacy or like distance. Ray Charles listened to her with the complete attention he gave everyone, and then said something about the difference between being heard and being understood that Gladys Knight later described as the truest thing anyone had ever said to her about the experience of being a singer. Natalie Cole came, Johnny Mathis came, Van Morrison came. Each of them sat with Ray Charles before the session began. Each of them received something that was specific to them, not a general dispensation of wisdom, but the particular response of a man who had listened carefully to who they were and had found something to say that was addressed specifically to that person. This was not accidental. This was not the natural generosity of a man in a good mood. This was Ray Charles doing something deliberately, with the specific intention that he had always brought to everything he did in a recording studio. He was making something that the album, once released, could only partially contain. 2. Per FUR. 1 HKNE Do. Ray Charles did not discuss his health publicly during the sessions. He did not tell the artists who came to record with him that he was ill, not in those terms, not directly, but several of them have said, in the years since, that they knew. Not from any specific statement he made, from the quality of his attention. People who spend time with someone who is dying, who knows they are dying and has made peace with that knowledge, often describe a particular quality in the dying person's presence. Not sadness, not the heaviness of anticipated grief. Something closer to the opposite, a quality of complete presence, of giving the current moment the full weight of attention that most people distribute across past and future simultaneously. Ray Charles in those final sessions had that quality. The artists who came to record with him described in various ways and with various degrees of specificity the experience of feeling more completely attended to than they had felt in any other professional situation. Not flattered, attended to. The specific experience of being in the presence of someone who is fully there, for whom the current moment is the only moment that exists. This is what a man does when he knows he is running short of time and has decided to spend what remains in complete presence. He stops managing the future, he stops processing the past. He is simply, completely, entirely there, in the room, at the piano, with the person in front of him. Ray Charles had always had an unusual quality of presence. It was one of the things that people who worked with him consistently noted. The sense that when he was with you, he was entirely with you, that his attention was not divided or managed or partially elsewhere. This quality, already extraordinary throughout his career, had intensified in those final months into something that the people who experienced it struggled to describe accurately. It was not performing presence. It was actual presence. At its most complete and most undiluted, he knew what he was doing. He knew the sessions were a form of goodbye. Not a dramatic one, not a performed one, not a goodbye that announced itself as such, but a goodbye nonetheless, a last long look at the thing he had loved most, populated with the people whose voices and presences he wanted to carry with him into whatever came after the sessions ended. 2 Parvati Lastui. The last recording session for Genius Loves Company took place in late 2003. Ray Charles was at the studio on time, prepared as he had been for every session. The artist for that final session has not been publicly identified as the last. The sessions were not labeled or marked in any way that made their order significant at the time. It was not known, that day, that it would be the last. But Ray Charles may have known. The quality of his attention that day, described by the engineer present as different from the preceding sessions, more interior, more private, more difficult to characterize, suggests a man who understood that something was ending. When the music was finished and the session was complete, Ray Charles sat at the piano for a period of time that the people present described as unusual in its length. Not playing, just sitting, his hands on the keys, not pressing them. The same posture that had been his throughout his life in studios. The posture of a man between music, in the space before the next thing starts. This time, there was no next thing. He sat at the piano in the studio where he had spent 50 years making music, his hands on the keys, in the silence that follows a recording session when everything that needed to be recorded has been recorded. The engineer waited. The people present waited. No one moved toward the lights or the equipment. They understood without anyone saying so that this moment was not one to interrupt. Eventually, Ray Charles stood. He found his cane. He said, to the room in general, that it had been a good day. Then he walked toward the door and the studio and that chapter of his life closed behind him. TEPILO'd him. Et T. recorded.ShareProject Genius Loves Company was released on August 31, 2004, more than 2 months after Ray Charles died on June 10 of that year. It won 8 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. It was the best-selling album of his career. These facts are part of the official record. They tell you that the album was successful, that it was recognized, that it reached people. They do not tell you what it contains. What it contains, beyond the songs, beyond the voices, beyond the technical achievement of the recordings, is the specific quality of a man's final attention, the particular presence of someone who has decided to spend his remaining time in complete engagement with the thing he loves, surrounded by the company of people who understand, even partially, what that thing is. Every artist who came to that studio and sat with Ray Charles before the session began received something specific to them, something they have carried in their music and in their professional lives in the years since. The record captures the musical result of those sessions. It does not and cannot capture those pre-session conversations, the hour before the tape started rolling, when Ray Charles asked his questions and listened to the answers and said the specific thing that needed to be said to the specific person sitting across from him. That is what is not on the record. That is what lives only in the people who received it, and in the music those people have made since, and in the specific quality of presence that Ray Charles brought to every moment of those final months. He had spent his entire life learning how to be completely present to the music and to the people who made it with him. At the end, he gave that presence, completely, without reserve, in every session, to every person who came through that door, as the last and most complete gift he had to give. The record is extraordinary, but the gift was given before the tape started rolling. And the people who received it have been living inside it ever since,